the lord of the original teachings of Ikain, a dark-cloaked figure rose from the fire and lightning. He is the leader of the others and the most important doctor of all mankind. Several monks stamped with black swords, glowing dark scarlet as if they were brick-colored, hung several meters above the ground, and everything around them was ablaze with hellish flames. A blond man with a monocle over his eye and a rather peculiar cut of his mouth was speaking. He said that there was no cure in Ikaine's system against me. He demanded and ordered them to get on their knees and beg for mercy for Ikaine's underlings, so that then and only then would he maybe spare them. Girls also begged the Lord not without to rest for them because the other will never submit to people. And in fact it was all strange. Why would he ask and beg for something of a man who was already doomed to die and would die very soon? Him, a nobody like him, could even use magic, right? Isn't that right? Then may the Almighty take his flesh and blood and bring his punishment upon these. The Lord was beside the blond man in a second, and grabbing him by the neck, he spoke a phrase through his teeth, telling him to be so kind as to die as soon as possible. But he didn't want to say goodbye to life, so he suddenly exclaimed that if the Overlord killed him, he wouldn't have time to save his demonesses. What a bastard. The white lancets that were flying at the demonesses ended up stuck in the flesh of their Overlord. The girl screamed in one voice, calling out for him. He began to pull the arrows out of himself, but stop. The man suggested they put it off for now. The handsome long-haired Ikaini from the CEO of Orange Cat Investment, sitting now surrounded by lovely ladies, was more interested in knowing why it was that the Dark Lord, the guy handed the image of this most disgust of today's hero to the people opposite him, looked exactly like himself. The creepy men in front of him flattered him that he, Dr. E, had a very keen eye. But they, when they created this game, unanimously decided that such a cool, unrestrained leader by his character even exactly reminds them of Director E, one of the girls. A blonde with emerald eyes approached him, said almost in the ear of the man that she also seems that he is super class. He just pulled her away from him, asking her not to get so close because she almost hit him with her chin. He went on to say that if these guys wanted to spend their own money, that was purely their own business, but to insult his personal aesthetic sense was inadmissible. After all, they didn't think they could get an investment just by buttering him up. He understood that this was the case. The men were embarrassed by this. He was about to leave when one of the beggars suddenly grabbed his leg and begged him to give the game a chance, because this was his dream, the dream of a lifetime. But he just grabbed him by the chest and told him that what he hated most in life was such scammers who extorted money from him by referring to dreams. He is an investor, not a philanthropist. Director E ordered this pathetic beggar not to dare look down on his money. He pulled out the game manual and spoke much more calmly. What they should study is the needs of the users, not his personal preferences. And he had such expectations for this project, he thought as he left the room. And as he crossed the threshold, he was surprised to find he had no solid ground under his feet. And then as he swayed, he realized that he was falling. The sky around him was roaring with all shades of pink or even crimson, staining the clouds in shades of peach, and the dawns crowned by a glowing red blood moon. In the next moment, he was already falling into the brightly colored unknown, where his exact replica, the mighty Lord, who had been killed by the poison, was now chained to his flesh by glowing white neon arrow chains that dug almost completely into his arms and shoulders, several of them in front and behind and between his ribs. All of his clothes consisting of a white shirt, a dark blue robe with gold ruffles, and black pants with a high waist. His henchwomen, the three beautiful demonesses, were also in these chains, but in a more humane way, without the blood and wounds. The glowing white neon weapons were simply wrapped around their legs, arms, and necks. The blond man with the monocle and the inhumanly wide smile just laughed a broken fractional hee-hee-hee laugh. He was addressing Ikaini with words that he couldn't even think of throwing himself into the arms of death to save his minion. The girls, on the other hand, shouted indignantly that the blond man was nothing. Who could have known that the deputy of the teachings of divine knowledge would first take advantage of him nearby and then strike from behind? That's despicable. He's just scum. Enraged, the blonde continued to speak, tusking and saying that he got this from one of them. The others, after all, the completely worthless others, should have been extinct long ago. And now it was time to use what was left of his power and send the minions of this pathetic henchman after their overlord. The next second, there was a deafening. What was that sound? It was as if something had fallen from a great height. Dust rose, spreading many meters in a circle, and in the middle of this cacophony was Ikaini, who badly hit his head on the ground, which was shattered into small pieces due to the force of the impact. And at the same moment, the end of the sinful life came for the blond man in the monocle. This place, half destroyed and burning, with fiery flames floating right through the air not far from the sea. But still, why does this place, where he has certainly never been, seem vaguely familiar to him? Meanwhile, one of the others, a blonde demoness with skin the color of chocolate, fell to her knees, dropping burning tears that ran down her cheeks in an unrelenting waterfall. The Lord, he really is dead. And the other, the fair-skinned maiden with the blue-black long hair, assured Jilia, as the first was called, that they, alas, had no time for grief. They must never allow the news of the Lord's vengeance to reach the people. Otherwise, some would be in mortal danger. The third, the smallest and fragile, looked at Ikaini and said that he was very similar to their Lord. Ikaini himself was not particularly ceremonious. He said hello to the girls at once and demanded answers to his 3 questions. Whether they had ever heard of the collection of morning flowers picked at dusk, whether they knew about China, and whether they had ever heard the phrase globe. What can I say? They looked at him as if he were insane, not understanding at all what he was talking about. And from this, to his regret, he determined that in some incomprehensible way, he found himself in another world. The girls were not left in debt, immediately began to ask about who he was and where he came from. On what Ikaini thought that a brilliant idea for the beginning of communication with the girls' demons, who had just lost his master and ruler, will be jokes from the category of not to the stage for dummies. And following this wonderful idea, he said that he usually prefers not to communicate with Lolly, but for them will make an exception. At his words, Jilia only fell into irritation, even though she did not understand the meaning of the words he said, and he continued to rant. He said that he came here from another world, and now he is here as if the protagonist of this story, and he had a lot of adventures ahead of him and a way to the top of his career. The dark-haired woman began sniffing him for some reason and concluding that he even smelled like their dead lord, which meant that he looked more like him than just his appearance. She proposed him to Jilia. It seemed to her that he should be suitable. Jilia was apparently ready to accept the dark-haired woman's words. She asked him, slightly embarrassed, to bail out their tribe and pretend to be their lord, impersonate a dark lord. Wait, that dead guy was too much like him. A recent game scene appeared before Ikaini's eyes. A puzzle formed in his mind, and the conclusion was that he seemed to be caught up in this very game. Meanwhile, the girls were reassuring each other, saying that since their lord had died for them, they should live for him and his memory. She did a magical scattering of the corpse, turning it into a glowing little purple spark ball, and coming up to Ikaini, said that she didn't have enough reasons to convince him so that he would unconditionally agree. Still, would he be willing to save them? Given the cliché of getting into other worlds, there is usually a chance to go back once you're in the world of the game, after you've completely gone through it. Relying on his abilities, his debut as a Dark Lord, as well as having the game's spoilers, it will be, well, very easy for him. He accepted the offer of their dark current, but he made a mistake already on the first turn. The pearl of mana shouldn't have been eaten, it should have just been worn on his clothes. Well, and you can't spit it back out anymore. The guy kept trying to stay calm. What's required of him now? The most fragile of the demonesses asked him to come over and gave him the tin of the murdered blonde, and told him to behave like a winner. And so Ikaini threw her off the steep wall, shouting that the Lord is invincible. News of the original doctrine's victory spread across the mainland. Clouds of war hung over the tribe of others. However, Ikaini, who was in the middle of this hurricane, was in complete ignorance. His name is Ikaini, and even though he took the position of Dark Lord in less than an hour, it became obvious to him that his profession involves a high risk. His subordinates, who came to him, did not always understand the meaning of his words, but they were quickly dealt with by one of the demonesses, who loudly and very intelligibly explained the Lord's position on certain matters, not infrequently not failing to put his threats into practice. She was a dark-skinned succubus named Jilia. She was the Lord's personal secretary. She was sweet, but sometimes she acted frightening. The other sister, the one with the impressive breasts and the beautiful long dark hair that went a shade of blue, was called Bane Amy. She was in charge of the information department, and if you disregard a couple of her oddities about the ways of obtaining this very information, he was quite cool. The third, the new overlord watched for a while a pretty girl with a carriage of wheat-colored white hair and cute cat ears and a ponytail holding a flower, and then all of a sudden ate the poor plant, came to the conclusion that completely, from the word completely, did not understand her and even considered a bit strange. Her name was Kaneko. The 3 girls had asked him to impersonate a Dark Lord. Fortunately, that status is not bad enough. Plus, he has a game manual. Oh, still, allowing him to be a Dark Lord from the start. This world is already lost. The sparse gray mass of clouds beneath the night domes was cut through by branching golden lightning at the fair-haired girl's brief command. The thunder roared through the area as the clouds collided into one, the harbingers of the coming storm. And at once a bright spot appeared from the blackening night sky, void with a huge golden spear in the hands of an impressive-looking girl with a wheat shade of blonde long hair, and a huge covering half of her face, a massive golden prebluto on her head, something like a sun crown with rays around her head in the form of a shining nimbus. Nevertheless, This exotic girl was in no mood for peaceful negotiation. She attacked indiscriminately, flinging her golden lightning bolts in every direction. The succubus Gilia, who was frightened and called out to her overlord, was the first to be struck. The beam of bursting magical energy touched her body, and she sank to her knees, unable to resist the exhaustion that enveloped her and thinking to herself what on earth was happening to her. For when the discharge hit her, her dark energy came in a ceaseless, restless movement. This is bad. The magical energy in her body was surging through. At some point it happened. The magical energy burst out in a huge violet, not to be missed outburst, and dried up, leaving her mistress powerless. Bane Amy was beside her in the same state. The energy of these charms was overpowering. Could it be a supernatural power surpassing magic? Was it possible that it was an angry Valkyrie of the teachings of divine knowledge? Bane Amy didn't think they really existed, so she was the one who made his underlings cry. The demonesses rejoiced at the Lord's appearance. It was about time he showed up. So what? Apparently she is a Valkyrie of the divine teachings. But how? Hadn't the Dark Lord been affected? And it couldn't be. Based on the game configurations, a Valkyrie should only appear in a future add-on. This is a boss with a higher order power system. You could say that its power is a whole version ahead of the other NPS. If his disguise is discovered, no one can save him. He slammed the manual shut. He was of no use at the moment anyway. He decided to bluff, said she was just in time. For his interest in standard mediocre human power had already dried up, had cooled down, and whether he could be introduced to so-called divine power. He ordered her to use all her lightning bolts and aim them at him. Her trump card had its own killing power. But when the divine power contained in the lightning bolts penetrates someone else's body, there is a detonation effect of the affected person's magical energy. In other words, the stronger the magic and its energy, the more deadly and painful it will be for the affected person. But nothing worked on him, which surprised everyone here. But he wasn't of this world, so there was no magic and no magical energy to detonate. He told Valkyrie that she had served him well. For that, he would show leniency for her past transgressions and allow her to retreat, preserving her honor. She, on the other hand, said that, as she expected, he was like a Dark Lord, too dangerous, and therefore she must kill him here and now. The Valkyrie roared die with a wild beast and lunged at the Dark Lord with her spear of lightning. Her thunderous, glowing weapon passed within an inch of Ikayane's throat. However, after his remark that even though she was a Valkyrie, the value of military valor did not seem to interest her, the owner of this spear sword felt ashamed of her inappropriate behavior, so she had the courage to challenge him, only when he had not yet recovered from his past wounds. At this, the angry and bruised Valkyrie sliced through the dilapidated stone wall of the castle, once a majestic structure of long-gone years, with her branching electric lightning discharges in her hands. In a second, she approached the newly minted Dark Lord and promised that on the next full moon, she would meet face to face right there. And then she soared into a bright white spark with yellow around the edges and disappeared, vanishing into thin air. He was saved. Suddenly, a turquoise instructional sign appeared out of thin air. It read, SVI identification successfully completed. The process of unlocking special skills has been initiated. What else is it? Grasping his sore head, the newly minted Dark Lord Ikayane didn't understand while his subordinate demonesses were shouting at him about how cool he was. After all, he himself had personally forced the Valkyrie to leave, relying only on rhetoric, without any magic. But why didn't her magic work on him? How had it worked on him? All of this was of interest to the restless, succubus girl Julia, but Ikayan did not answer, only ducked, or rather put his head between the girl's breasts. She only exclaimed his name, surprised by the behavior of her Dark Lord. The turquoise screen lit up again, and the words, exploring user memories, localization of memories with maximum peak emotionality, search for the most difficult to erase moments, sampling completed. A photo frame of 3 people. The father of the family, the mother in a long white dress, and a happy boy in a suit, fell and shattered on the floor into 1,000 pieces, dear to my heart. The next shot is of an iron faucet that has not been twisted all the way in. Droplets of water continue to flow out of it, silvery in the light, falling and crashing into the unknown. The third shot that follows depicts a boy with a photograph in his father's hands. He turns to his father, for he no longer hears his mother's voice, and the latter only tells Kayanya that no matter what happens to him in the future, he must survive at all costs. The frames disappear, and a sign with turquoise letters reappears before my eyes, analyzing user aspirations, triggering ability generation processes. He jumps up in bed. Phew, it's just a dream again. The man, the newly minted Dark Lord that others now worship, rises in bed and looks around. What is this place? And where is the game manual? A mulatto succubus appears before him, holding the thing he had lost sight of, a thin book in Chinese. As she spoke a long extinct divine language, Yep, the language of the creators is a divine language genius. But now the girl thinks he's someone of divine origin, which is generally a nice bonus. She says that he really was sent by the gods to save the race of others, and so she asked that he be allowed to help crush the Valkyries in a rather interesting way, which is to be expected from a harem game. Such configurations, and for no reason, would pass inspection. No way. Meanwhile, the demoness Gilia tied his hands with her tail and asked to take her whole. She didn't want to lose him again, and so she approached his lips, flaming her cheeks, forced the characteristic system activated, identification and verification of SITEM of rank Pearl Mina absolute inconsistency programmed body unable tie this tan magical energy activation of special skill resistance to death grades 1. These words popped up on the turquoise boards that had reappeared out of thin air. He was frightened by their contents, and for good reason. His body was ablaze with savage pain, as if every cell of his body had exploded in a fiery tornado. He screamed as hard as he could. An OVIERLOAD of magical energy was DTCTED. The physical seal would soon be destroyed. The succubus was worried about what was wrong with him, but there was nothing she could do as Ichani's body was somehow too quickly covered in red bloody slashing wounds. The next second, as Gilia called out the Dark Lord's name, his body was torn into small pieces that looked more like a bloody mess. Only the skull that was stained with poor Ichani's blood skittered across the floor, breaking the frightened and tense silence that had been created in an instant with a resounding sound. Did she just kill the Lord with her own hands? Gilia was not so much in shock as she was in awe. Here, what I have to show for it. How did I even die? I never thought I'd be able to avoid a deadly Valkyrie attack. But you don't get to outlast a light kiss from a charming succubus. Besides, the complexity of this world is too high. At the headquarters of the Dark Doctrine, Bane Amy opened the iron cloche and lifted it with 2 fingers. Underneath it hid the head of the very blonde man with the monocle. It turns out he wasn't dead at all. Yeah, it wasn't easy to kill him. The head of the deputy head of divine knowledge, the son of the supreme god Odin Vali, was laughing, answering that it really was, unlike the Dark Lord Yitani, who he finished off recently, the same one who had just exploded in his bedroom. The girl put the fork to his eye, intending to poke it out, but it had the strange effect of bending, its prongs. The head laughed, in vain though, at the fact that it couldn't even hurt him, to which the girl shoved a handful of hot peppers at him, making him chew. Kainko came in. She said that she had managed to get everything that Bane had asked for. There was durian and stinky tofu and canned herring and snail noodles, hell for a sensitive nose. Everything was packed in here. With all this mess, they covered the head, which was somehow very difficult to hurt physically, and covered it back up with a lid. Just at that moment, a dark-skinned succubus in a shirt burst into the hall. She told Bane Mia everything. That things were bad, and that their lord had exploded in the same place. Meanwhile, at the scene of the explosion, just lying there was Yitani's skull all covered in blood. But what's going on anyway? SVIP Network User Support Service. A new sign read. The QLAP city of the player's core pieces, due to an XCSIOV load of magical energy, was DTCTED. Obure Fananaloises. Of the issues of magical energy, he's beacon. The gem of knowledge, given to him by the master of the initial teachings. Divine power, given to him by Valkyrie of the teachings of divine knowledge. And Elyssi, given to him by his kiss with the succubus Gilia. There was so much strange stuff in that body. No wonder it exploded. Analysis of the special innovation of the Death Convention has begun. The sign that reads the text appeared out of thin air again. The magical power is Abiotocontinulicenorigenetathabody. And the enenu physical shale gains resistancy to the ATTCKs, it manages to edist. The epiphetate began to ove irala, and tachyephesit. Bones reappeared, fingers and toes restored to the smallest detail. The entire musculoskeletal system subsequently covered in skin, muscles, and all that. What Ikai and Nyai had before he died. The new plaque said that the Dark Lord should continue to be physically attacked, and have his physical shell pulverized until his body adapted to self-healing and magical energy. Yeah, the recommendations were terrible. But what the hell? The Mulata Succubus Gilia, the rest of the demonesses burst into the room, and the Dark Lord was already flying under the ceiling like a balloon. But hadn't he just been blown up? He did not answer, but instead asked which of them all was stronger in hand-to-hand combat, and asked the man to attack him quickly. The mulatto came forward, the demoness saying that hand-to-hand combat technique is a racial talent of succubi. Bamia, on the other hand, did not wait by the sea, and with the help of her eyes of exposure, realized that his body was bursting with magical energy, but the physical shell was continuously regenerating damage. A mysterious balance was thus achieved. Kainko threw a dart at him, and that was enough to deflate the Overlord. However, he demanded to stop joking. His body could explode again. The succubus could not raise a hand to the Overlord. Kainko did not have enough physical strength, and the Bane offered the candidacy of their new girl. There was a tug of war in the hall. Several adult pandas couldn't compete with someone on the other side. And that someone turned out to be a pretty fragile girl, or rather a girl who had long been bored. She was bored and tired of everything. Suddenly, someone came for her. The Lord summoned her. Finally, their Lord took the time to accept her summons. A few days earlier, walking into a rather bright-looking alleyway, a blonde, blue-eyed girl dressed in white in her magical-style battle robes, and wrapped in a cloak and half-robe with an impressively sized hood. According to the arrangements, the liaison was supposed to be around here somewhere, but there wasn't a human soul nearby. Suddenly, from nowhere, a strange human voice sounded. He said a special code password, which she was told she would hear when she found the informant. Blondie still couldn't figure out which side of the speech it came from. "The winds of winter have already subsided," was the password. Well, in any case, she could answer it first, and then she could find out who the mysterious informant was who decided not to show his face to the girl. Her part of the sentence read, "But the glory of the gods will eventually return." But then, from the side of the dog sitting in the shadow of the archway, which looked like a big, royally beautiful husky with cold monograms on his head, apparently serving as jewelry, a human speech was heard. The blonde standing in front of him from this turn of events came into a small shock, but soon recovered, talked to the dog, listening to him not too carefully, with such force she wanted to hug and brush him, and soon the girl could not restrain herself in the face of such a temptation. The dog, meanwhile, was talking, introducing himself. It turned out that his name was Gray, and he was her liaison. The dog also asked her not to be surprised by his appearance. He explained that his ability gave him the ability to turn into whatever he wanted to become, into any animal. And so he asked not to forget it in the future by any means. And suddenly he asked her, loudly and insistently, to stop stroking him. But how could she restrain herself? Because he was so big, fluffy, soft, sweet. She reluctantly pulled away, blushing a little guiltily, and drawing her eyes to the floor and nervously and embarrassingly tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear, and apologizing. There was no way she could contain herself at all. The dog looked at the girl with a stern, haughty look, not expressing the slightest indulgence for her person and urging her to listen carefully, to listen to his assignment. As if the order came directly from the Lord himself, began his speech. The girl, who continued to blush very badly for no reason at all, had to join the ranks of the inner circle of the dark doctrine and gather absolutely all possible information about his dark lord. The dog also asked not to fail to use any and all possible means of obtaining this very information. And the infantile girl kept thinking to herself about how she would still like to take this dog to herself. The semi-darkness, diluted only by candle lanterns, located at a decent distance from each other, still did not end. And on it walked beside each other two girls, both blondes, one with long hair, up to the waist, wearing blue and white robes, and the other with short, barely reaching his shoulders hair, cat ears, and ponytail, dressed in black, gold, and white shades. Finally, when she had brought the new girl to the huge 2 or 3 human-sized doors, with different, slightly darker, perhaps burned on the side for greater effect on the end patterns, the demoness, who had not said a word, said briefly that they were in place. The one with the cute cat ears, with her amber eyes flaring a little worriedly, began to explain that the Dark Lord was now practicing extremely advanced magic, and therefore the blonde could use absolutely any fighting techniques, but the use of any magical energy was forbidden at all. She did not elaborate on why it was strictly forbidden to use magic, and was it really necessary? As practice showed, it was not necessary, because the violet-eyed one was quite satisfied with such an arrangement, at least because from her point of view, muscles were much more trustworthy than magic, which in general was not surprising at all. With her 2 muscles, she pushed the doors to the hall, and begging in a final word, she didn't hold back. There, standing completely unperturbed in the middle of the hall, with his bare torso pierced by several different cold implements, such as sabers, rapiers, knives, and swords, through, and with his magic healing, the heavy bleeding wounds. In front of the newcomers, he pulled a dagger from his abdomen, without so much as an eyebrow, and threw it to the floor. The wound immediately gushed out in a burgundy stream of hot, hoggy, bodily fluid blood. Well, this girl has come at last. Purple magical surges were enfolded in all the swords and other edged weapons he had pulled out of him himself. The girl was momentarily taken aback by it all. Why would the Dark Lord pierce himself with multiple blades? And what kind of technique was he practicing in that case? In addition, the magical energy surrounding this young man was somehow too oppressive. He reeked of a dark, sweeping powerfulness. She noticed that all those wounds that had bled less than a moment ago had now healed and disappeared altogether. And the Dark Lord, Ikainu himself, was actually ready to roll on the floor right now from the pain tearing his body apart. He was ready to climb the wall from it. Even though his body was stamped with enchanted swords, which, by the way, caused damage all the time, it was still only barely enough to avoid self-detonation. one of the demonesses, the one who brought the blonde, noted that with these swords, it was her idea. The other two, standing on the floor balcony, stood discussing the newcomer. Bane said the following about her, that she was a newcomer who had recently joined them and possessed a rare non-magical essence. Just by training and hardening her body, she gained abilities that should not be discounted, ignored, or underestimated. Saying this, Bane Mia smoked an elegant pipe, exhaling clouds of blue smoke from time to time. But there could be no such thing at all. Could there be those who don't possess even a drop of magical abilities and magical energy? What is she waiting for? Let her attack already. Come and fight to the death.